There is a moment, somewhere in the cold gray waters of the North Pacific, when two groups of orca pass within a few hundred meters of one another and do not interact at all. They do not greet, they do not fight. They simply glide past each other as though the other group does not exist. To a casual observer, this might seem unremarkable, but to the scientists who have spent decades studying these animals, that silent passing represents one of the most profound mysteries in the animal kingdom. Because these two groups are not strangers, in the way that two humans from different countries might be strangers. They live in the same ocean, they breathe the same air, they are genetically speaking the same species. And yet the rules by which they live are so different, so deeply embedded, so fiercely maintained, that the two groups might as well be citizens of different planets. If you have ever watched a nature documentary and found yourself thinking that animals are simply driven by instinct, that they react to hunger and fear and the need to reproduce without anything resembling a social code, then Orca will shatter that assumption completely. What researchers have uncovered over 50 years of field observation is not simply interesting, it is genuinely world-altering in its implications. These animals have culture, they have dialects, they have rules about who can eat what, who can mate with whom, how the dead are mourned, how strangers are treated, and how knowledge is passed from one generation to the next. And crucially, those rules are different in every ocean, different between pods in the same ocean, different between matrilines within the same pod. The rules are not written anywhere. They are not encoded in the genes in any straightforward way. They are learned. They are practiced. They are enforced. And scientists, after half a century of watching and recording and arguing and revising their theories, are still not entirely sure how any of it works. Before we go any further, make sure you hit subscribe. This channel goes deep into the hidden lives of animals and the science that is slowly, painstakingly pulling back the curtain on what they are actually doing and why. If that is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, you are in the right place. So let us start at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can get, given that orca have been doing this for a very long time. The killer whale, Orcinus orca, is the largest member of the dolphin family. That alone is worth sitting with for a moment. When most people hear the word dolphin, they think of something small and sleek and playful. The orca is all of those things, but it is also 6 to 8 meters long and can weigh up to 6,000 kilograms. A mature male's dorsal fin can reach nearly 2 meters in height, an unmistakable silhouette against the surface of any ocean. They are found in every ocean on Earth, from the tropics to the poles, and they are apex predators everywhere they live. Nothing hunts them. Nothing, in the natural world, has ever successfully preyed upon a healthy adult orca. And yet, despite this extraordinary physical dominance, the social life of the orca is not built on brute force. It is built on something far more interesting. The fundamental unit of orca society is the matriline. At the center of every matriline is a female, usually old, often ancient by the standards of wild animals, and she is the keeper of everything that matters. Her knowledge, accumulated over decades of living and watching and failing and succeeding, is the engine that drives her family's survival. She knows where the salmon run in lean years, when the usual routes are empty. She remembers the patterns of prey that her grandchildren have never encountered before. She communicates that knowledge in ways that science is only beginning to understand, through a system of vocalizations so complex and so specific to each group that researchers describe it not as a call repertoire, but as a dialect. And this is where things begin to get truly strange. In the waters off the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, scientists have been watching and listening to orca since the early 1970s. The work began with a man named Michael Bigg, a Canadian marine biologist who had a radical idea. Rather than trying to count orca populations from boats, guessing at numbers that were impossible to verify, Bigg began photographing individual animals. Every nick, every notch, every scar on a dorsal fin was unique, he realized, as unique as a human fingerprint. Over years of patient photography, he built up a catalog of individuals so complete that today researchers can identify virtually every orca in the Pacific Northwest population on site. And what that catalog revealed was extraordinary. The orca of the Pacific Northwest fall into several distinct groups, and those groups do not mix, not in any meaningful social sense. The two main groups are what researchers now call residents and transients. Residents eat fish, almost exclusively salmon, Chinook salmon in particular. Transients eat marine mammals, seals, sea lions, porpoises, dolphins, the occasional minke whale, and the rule that separates these two groups is absolute. A resident orca does not eat marine mammals. A transient orca does not eat fish. These are not preferences, they are not tendencies. They are rules, and they are maintained across generations with a consistency that has never been observed to break down in decades of continuous monitoring. When you first hear this, it seems almost too clean to be true. Why would an animal that could eat both choose to eat only one? The salmon-eating residents share the water with abundant populations of seals and sea lions. The seal-eating transients swim through waters thick with salmon, and yet neither group crosses the line. The researchers who first documented this pattern were themselves skeptical of their own data. They looked for exceptions and found almost none. They looked for explanations based purely on ecology, on prey availability, on physical adaptations, and found that those explanations could not account for the rigidity of the boundary. The answer that gradually emerged from the data was cultural transmission. These rules are learned, not inherited, and they are learned so early and so thoroughly that they become, for all practical purposes, absolute. A calf born into a resident matriline learns from its first weeks of life that the correct response to a salmon is to pursue it and eat it, and that the correct response to a seal is to ignore it. The matriarch and the other experienced members of the family model this behavior constantly. The calf practices, the calf watches, the calf is corrected gently but firmly when it makes mistakes. And by the time that calf is old enough to hunt independently, the rule is as deeply embedded as anything in its behavioral repertoire. Now move roughly 4,000 kilometers to the northwest, to the waters around Kamchatka in Russia, and you find orca that look almost identical to the Pacific Northwest animals. Same black and white markings, same general body shape, same basic social structure built around matrilines, but different rules. The resident populations of Kamchatka eat salmon too, but the composition of their diet is different. They show preferences for different salmon species. Their response to boats is different. Their vocalizations, their dialects, are so different from the Pacific Northwest residents that a linguist comparing the two groups might struggle to find common grammatical ground. They are not the same culture living in different places. They are genuinely different cultures, as different from one another as the culture of a fishing village in Norway is from the culture of a fishing village in Japan. And then go further still. Cross the Pacific entirely and drop down into the Southern Ocean, into the waters around Antarctica, and you encounter orca that operate in a world so different from their Pacific counterparts that for decades, researchers questioned whether they should even be called the same species. The Southern Ocean orca have been studied intensively since the 1980s, particularly around the Antarctic Peninsula and the waters near the Crozet Islands and the Kerguelen Archipelago. What researchers found there was not simply a population of orca with different food preferences. What they found was a collection of distinct types, each with its own appearance, its own prey, its own hunting techniques, and its own social rules, all living in more or less the same ocean, often within sight of one another, and not mixing. Type A orca in the Southern Ocean are large, highly mobile animals that hunt minke whales in the open water of the Antarctic. They are coordinated hunters, working in groups to isolate and exhaust their prey in long chases across open water. Type B orca, sometimes called pack ice orca, hunt seals in an entirely different way. They work in tight groups to create waves that wash their prey off ice floes, a technique that requires precise coordination between multiple individuals, split-second timing, and what can only be described as an understanding of fluid dynamics that a physics student might envy. Type C orca are smaller, live in larger groups, and feed almost entirely on Antarctic toothfish. Type D orca, rarely seen, distinguished by their tiny eye patches, appear to be a genuinely cryptic population whose habits remain largely mysterious to science. Each of these types maintains its own cultural rules. They do not crossbreed with one another, or do so only very rarely. They do not share food. They do not appear to engage in the kinds of social interactions that would be expected between members of the same species in close proximity. And the technique that Type B orca use to wash seals off ice floes, the wave-washing technique, is not instinctive. It cannot be. It is too complex, too variable, too dependent on real-time adjustment to local conditions. It has to be taught, and it is taught, over months of observation and practice, with the older, more experienced animals modeling the behavior and the younger ones watching, attempting, failing, being gently guided, and eventually succeeding. The question of how such different cultural traditions could emerge within a single species is one that keeps behavioral ecologists awake at night. The most plausible answer involves a process that researchers call cultural drift, combined with something that looks remarkably like cultural selection. When a group of animals becomes isolated from other groups, their behavior can begin to diverge. Small differences in prey preference, small differences in hunting technique, small differences in the way a particular matriarch responds to a particular situation, these small differences get transmitted to the next generation. Over time they accumulate, and because the groups do not mix, because the cultural transmission is vertical rather than horizontal, meaning it goes from parent to offspring, rather than spreading horizontally through a population, those differences are preserved and amplified rather than diluted. But cultural drift alone cannot explain everything, because the differences between orca populations are not random. They are not simply the result of behavioral mutations drifting through isolated groups. They are functional. The wave-washing technique used by Type B orca in the Southern Ocean is not a random behavioral quirk. It is an exquisitely effective hunting strategy, precisely adapted to the specific ecological challenges those animals face. Which means that at some point, in some matriline, an innovation occurred. A new behavior was invented, and then it spread, through observation, through teaching, through practice, and it stuck. The idea that animals can invent new behaviors and then transmit those inventions through their social group is not new. It has been documented in chimpanzees, in dolphins, in various bird species, but in orca, the scale and the precision of this process is unlike anything seen elsewhere. Because the orca are not just transmitting individual techniques, they are transmitting entire cultural packages. The diet, the hunting technique, the dialect, the social rules, the responses to strangers, all of these things are bundled together and transmitted as a unit, from one generation to the next, with a fidelity that rivals anything observed in human cultural transmission. Consider the dialects. The vocalizations of orca are among the most extensively studied sounds in the animal kingdom. Researchers have recorded and analyzed thousands of hours of orca calls from populations around the world, and what they have found is a system of extraordinary complexity. Each matriline has a distinctive repertoire of calls. The members of a matriline share most of their calls with one another, which makes sense given that they learn their calls from their mothers and other close relatives. But the call repertoires also contain shared elements that link multiple matrilines together, and these shared elements define what researchers call pods, and the shared elements between pods define clans. The dialect boundaries between clans in the Pacific Northwest are sharp. Two clans may live in the same waters, eat the same prey, encounter one another regularly, and yet maintain entirely distinct vocal repertoires. The calls of one clan are not simply variations on the calls of another clan. They are genuinely different. Different enough that a trained researcher can identify a clan from its calls alone, without ever seeing the animals. And those calls are stable across generations. The calls recorded from Pacific Northwest orca in the 1970s are recognizably the same as the calls recorded from the descendants of those animals today, 50 years later. The dialects are not drifting, they are being actively maintained. And here is where it gets deeply puzzling. Because if the dialects are simply a byproduct of cultural isolation, simply what happens when groups stop mixing, then you would expect them to drift slowly over time. You would expect occasional innovations to enter the repertoire, occasional calls to be dropped, a gradual accumulation of change in the way that languages change when they are isolated from one another. And some of that does happen, but the rate of change is far slower than any model based purely on drift would predict, which suggests that something is actively working to preserve the dialects. Some process of correction, of reinforcement, of enforcement. And there is evidence that orca do enforce their dialects. Animals that produce calls inconsistent with the group repertoire appear to receive social feedback that discourages that behavior. Animals that produce the correct calls are reinforced. The dialect is not just a marker of group identity, it is a social requirement. You must speak the right way to be a full member of this group. The parallels with human language and human social identity are obvious, and they are uncomfortable, because they force us to reckon with the possibility that something we have long thought of as uniquely human, the use of cultural markers to define group membership and police the boundaries of identity, is not uniquely human at all. Now move to the North Atlantic, to the waters around Norway and Iceland, where some of the most spectacular orca hunting behavior ever filmed has been recorded. The orca of the Norwegian coast are herring specialists. During the winter months, vast schools of herring aggregate in the fjords of northern Norway, and the orca follow them in groups that can number in the hundreds, among the largest orca aggregations ever observed. And the technique they use to hunt those herring is, again, a cultural product. They call it carousel feeding. A group of orca works together to herd a school of herring into a tight ball near the surface. They use coordinated swimming to compress the school, to prevent individuals from escaping, to keep the ball tight and panicked. Then individual animals take turns to rush through the ball, striking fish with their tails and stunning them. The stunned fish are then picked up and eaten. The whole operation requires precise coordination between multiple animals, clear communication about roles and timing, and a body of knowledge about herring behavior that only experience can provide. The older females lead the hunts. They position themselves at the outer edges of the herring ball, monitoring it, making adjustments, communicating instructions to the other members of the group through a rapid exchange of calls. The younger animals watch and learn, taking more active roles as their skills develop. A young orca that attempts carousel feeding for the first time will almost certainly get it wrong. Its movements will be too fast or too slow or wrongly timed, and fish will escape. The experienced animals appear to compensate for these errors, adjusting their own positions to cover for the youngster's mistakes, giving the juvenile the opportunity to practice without catastrophic consequences for the hunt. And then, in the North Atlantic, move to the waters around the Shetland Islands and the Faroe Islands, and you find orca with a completely different relationship to herring and to one another. The orca that roam those colder northern waters have smaller group sizes, less stable matrilineal associations, and prey on seabirds and fish in ways that look quite different from the highly coordinated carousel feeding of the Norwegian fjords. They are not a different species. They are barely even a different population by genetic measures. But their culture is different. Their rules are different, and those differences are maintained across generations with the same stubborn persistence observed everywhere else orca have been studied. Go to New Zealand, to the waters off the Crozet Islands, to Patagonia, to the Salish Sea, and everywhere you look you find the same thing. Distinct cultural packages, distinct rules, distinct dialects, and a fierce commitment to maintaining those differences even when the animals share the same ocean, even when they encounter one another regularly, even when mixing with other groups would seem, from a purely genetic standpoint, to be advantageous. The genetic data makes this particularly striking. When researchers analyze the DNA of orca from different cultural groups in the same geographic area, they find that those groups are more genetically distinct from one another than would be expected given their proximity and their shared environment. The cultural separation is producing genetic separation. The rules about who you can mate with, maintained culturally, are driving evolutionary divergence in a species that occupies a single connected global ocean. The orca are, in effect, sorting themselves into new species entirely on the basis of culturally maintained rules. Not because they cannot interbreed, but because they choose not to. Because the rules say they should not. This is a concept that biologists have known about in theory for decades. They call it cultural speciation. But the orca appear to be doing it on a timescale and at a magnitude that has few, if any, parallels in the animal kingdom. And the rules that are driving it are cultural rules. Rules about food and association and dialect and identity. Rules that exist not in the genome but in the accumulated knowledge of matrilineal families. Rules that are learned and enforced and passed down with a fidelity that begins to look, uncomfortably, like tradition. Which brings us to one of the most extraordinary and most contested areas of orca research, the question of orca grief. The image that brought this into the public consciousness was a photograph taken in the summer of 2018 in the waters of the Salish Sea. An orca named Tahlequah, a member of the critically endangered southern resident killer whale population, gave birth to a calf that died within 30 minutes. And then, for 17 days, Tahlequah carried her dead calf at the surface. She pushed it with her snout. She balanced it on her head. When it sank, she dove to retrieve it. She carried it for over 1,000 miles of ocean travel. And members of her family stayed close to her throughout, taking turns to help carry the calf, to stay near her, to slow their travel to match hers. The scientific community was divided on how to interpret this behavior. Some researchers argued that carrying dead calves is a known behavior in cetaceans, and that it should not be anthropomorphized, that we cannot know whether what Tahlequah experienced was grief, in any sense that we would recognize. Others argued that the duration of the behavior, 17 days, its coordination, involving multiple family members, and its apparent toll on the physical condition of the carrying female, argued for something beyond simple maternal instinct. something that looked very much like communal mourning. Something that looked very much like a social rule about how the dead are treated. And within the southern resident population specifically, this behavior appears to be consistent. Multiple females in the population have been observed carrying dead calves for extended periods. The behavior appears to be transmitted culturally, or at least maintained socially, in a way that is not observed in the transient populations or in many of the other orca populations around the world. The southern residents have rules about grief, about what you do when a member of your family dies. And those rules are different from the rules of other orca populations in the same ocean. The southern residents are a population under extreme pressure. There are currently fewer than 75 individuals remaining, and the population has been declining. The reasons are multiple and interconnected. Reduced availability of Chinook salmon, their primary food source, disruption from boat traffic and underwater noise, and the legacy of historical captures for marine parks, which removed dozens of animals from the population in the 1960s and 70s, and disproportionately took the young animals who would have been the current generation of experienced matriarchs. The cultural knowledge held by those matriarchs, the knowledge of where to find salmon in lean years, the knowledge of specific hunting techniques, the social knowledge about how to maintain group cohesion under stress, that knowledge cannot be recovered from genetics. It is gone, and its absence is felt in every lean winter that the southern residents face without the guidance of the elders they should have had. This is perhaps the most practically important implication of what we know about orca culture. Populations cannot be managed purely as genetic units. The cultural knowledge held by specific individuals, particularly old females, is a resource as real and as irreplaceable as the food in the water or the space in the ocean. When a matriarch dies, her family loses not just a leader but an archive. And in a population already struggling to survive, that loss can be catastrophic. Research published in the last decade has quantified this in ways that were previously impossible. In a study of data from both Pacific Northwest residents and a long-studied orca population in Scottish waters, researchers found a clear relationship between the presence of post-reproductive females and the survival rates of their family members. Orca are one of very few species in which females undergo menopause, living for decades after they stop reproducing. In the Pacific Northwest, females can live to their 90s or beyond. They stop reproducing in their 30s or 40s, which means that for the last 50 or 60 years of their lives, they are contributing to the group's survival not through reproduction, but through knowledge, through leadership, through the transmission of cultural information. The study found that when a post-reproductive female died, the survival rates of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren declined measurably in the years following her death. The effect was strongest in years when salmon were scarce. When food was abundant, the family could muddle through. When food was scarce, they needed the matriarch's knowledge of where else to look, and without that knowledge, they could not find it. The matriarch was not simply a social figurehead, she was a navigational system, a cultural repository, a teacher whose loss left her family cognitively impoverished. And this knowledge is not just about food. The matriarchs of the Pacific Northwest populations appear to maintain detailed social knowledge about other orca groups in the area. They remember which individuals belong to which matrilines. They remember the history of interactions between groups, which groups are friendly, which are to be avoided, which can be trusted as foraging partners in times of prey abundance. This kind of extended social knowledge, built up over decades of observation and interaction, is what allows the complex multi-group aggregations that form during salmon runs to function without descending into chaos. The matriarchs know the rules of engagement. They know who belongs where, and they make sure those rules are followed. Now think about the transient populations, the mammal-eating orca of the Pacific Northwest. Their social structure is very different from the residents. They live in smaller groups. Their associations are less stable. Offspring, particularly sons, disperse from their mothers more often than in the resident populations. They are quieter because the marine mammals they hunt have good hearing and can detect orca vocalizations, so the transients communicate primarily through whispers and silent approaches. They are stealthier, more solitary in their hunting, more flexible in their social arrangements. And yet they too have rules. Rules about how hunting parties are assembled, rules about prey choice, rules about the treatment of prey before and during a kill. Transient orca hunting seals in the Pacific Northwest have been observed engaging in what looks like play with their prey before killing it. They may toss a seal into the air repeatedly, bat it with their tails, chase it in circles. Scientists have debated whether this behavior serves a function, whether it is teaching the young to hunt, whether it is a form of prey assessment or whether it is simply something that these animals do because their culture includes it. The behavior varies between groups. Some groups do it, some do not, and the variation follows cultural lines, not genetic ones. The transients also show cultural variation in their responses to humans. Some groups in the Pacific Northwest have developed what researchers describe as a curious and relaxed attitude toward boats and swimmers, approaching vessels and engaging in what looks like investigative behavior. Others are consistently avoidant. Some groups have been observed approaching kayakers and circling them slowly in what appears to be investigative behavior, causing significant alarm to the humans involved but never making any move to cause harm. And other groups simply avoid all contact with humans entirely. These differences in human-orca relationship are culturally transmitted. They vary by matriline, by pod, by region, and they are maintained across generations with the same fidelity as the food rules and the dialect rules. In the waters around the southern tip of South America, near Punta Norte on the Argentine coast, there is a group of orca that have developed one of the most dramatic and terrifying hunting techniques in the animal world. They deliberately beach themselves, launching their massive bodies onto the shallow, sloping cobble beaches of the Patagonian coast to snatch sea lion pups from the shoreline. The technique requires the orca to monitor the position of potential prey on the beach from the water, to identify exactly the right moment and the right angle to launch an attack, to commit its enormous body to a partial stranding that could, if anything goes wrong, prove fatal, and then to wriggle back off the beach with its prey before the receding wave leaves it stranded. This is not something that any orca does instinctively. It cannot be. The risks are too high, the technique too specific, the window of success too narrow. It is learned, and it is learned in a very specific way. Young orca from this population are brought to the beach edge by their mothers from an early age. They observe attacks. They practice in shallow water. They make tentative attempts that fall short, that are timed wrong, that end with the young animal retreating back into deeper water empty-jawed. And the adults watch and wait, and eventually the juvenile gets it right, and the muscle memory is established, and the knowledge is added to the cultural package that this matriline will carry forward through the generations. This technique is not found in orca populations anywhere else in the world, even populations that live near beaches covered in sea lions. Orca in South Africa, near the Crozet Islands, in Alaska, in California, do not beach themselves to hunt sea lions. They have access to the same prey in similar environments. The technique exists only in the Patagonian population because it was invented there at some point in the past by some innovative individual and transmitted forward through cultural learning. It is, in the truest sense, a local tradition. And there are orca in other parts of the world who have developed their own local traditions that are equally specific and equally extraordinary. In the waters around the Crozet Islands in the southern Indian Ocean, orca have been observed hunting young elephant seals in the surf zone in a technique that shares some similarities with the Patagonian beaching, but is distinct in its details, adapted to the specific topography of those shores and the specific behavior of elephant seal pups rather than sea lion pups. The rules of engagement are different, the timing is different, the coordination between group members is different. It is not the same cultural package. It is a parallel development, a different solution to a similar problem, arrived at independently by a different group of animals, in a different ocean. And in the waters off New Zealand, orca have been documented hunting stingrays in the shallow coastal waters in a technique that involves flipping the rays upside down, inducing a state of tonic immobility in which the ray becomes momentarily paralyzed, and then consuming it safely. This technique protects the orca from the ray's venomous barb. It is a sophisticated, precise, culturally transmitted behavior that exists in the New Zealand population and, as far as researchers can determine, nowhere else. The orca of the Pacific Northwest do not hunt stingrays this way. The orca of Antarctica do not hunt stingrays this way. The technique belongs to New Zealand, and it belongs to specific family groups within the New Zealand population, groups whose elders know the technique and have passed it down to their young. What is emerging from all of this research is a picture of orca society as something far more culturally elaborate than anything scientists anticipated when they first began studying these animals in the early 1970s. The early researchers thought they were documenting behavioral ecology, diet preferences, habitat use, reproductive success. What they were actually documenting, though they did not yet have the conceptual framework to understand it, was something that looked very much like anthropology. They were mapping cultures. and the cultures are not simply interesting for their own sake. They have direct implications for conservation, for our understanding of animal cognition, and for the very definition of what it means to be a species. On the question of cognition, the cultural complexity of orca behavior implies cognitive capacities that are in some respects comparable to those of the great apes. The ability to learn from observation, to modify learned behaviors on the basis of experience, to transmit complex multi-step behavioral sequences from one individual to another, to maintain social rules across generations, and to innovate, to invent new behaviors and introduce them into the cultural repertoire. All of these capacities require a brain that is doing something more than simply processing sensory input and generating instinctive responses. The orca brain is larger relative to body size than most other mammals. It has a highly developed limbic system, the part of the brain associated with emotion, social bonding, and long-term memory. And it has a specialized type of neuron, called a spindle neuron or von Economo neuron, that was until recently thought to exist only in humans and the other great apes. Spindle neurons are associated with social awareness, with the ability to read the intentions and emotional states of others, with rapid intuitive decision-making in complex social situations. Their presence in the orca brain is not a coincidence. It is the neural substrate that makes the orca's social and cultural complexity possible. And the complexity is not just in the hunting behavior or the dialects, it is in the social fabric of orca life, in ways that go far beyond what any functional explanation can account for. There are the greetings. When two matrilines from the same pod encounter one another after a period of separation, they perform a greeting ceremony that has been documented in Pacific Northwest residents and in several other populations around the world. The two groups face each other at the surface. They stop moving. There is a period of stillness that can last several minutes. And then they come together, the animals intermingling, rolling over one another, rubbing bodies, producing a flood of vocalizations. The greeting ceremony is ritualized. It follows a consistent pattern. It is not simply an expression of social excitement. It is a cultural act, a performance of group identity, a reaffirmation of relationship. And the greeting ceremonies differ between populations. The specific form they take, the calls that are used, the duration of the stillness before the contact, the way the animals arrange themselves at the surface. All of these details vary between cultural groups. Each group has its own greeting protocol, its own social ritual, and members of the group learn those protocols as part of their cultural education, as part of what it means to belong to this family, this pod, this clan. There is the question of play. Orca play extensively, and in ways that appear to have no direct survival value. They surf waves, they toss objects, they engage in extended games with one another that seem to exist purely for the pleasure of the activity, and the play is culturally specific. Different populations have different preferred play behaviors. The orca of the Pacific Northwest have been documented playing with items as varied as kelp fronds, bird feathers, buoys, and, in several documented cases, live salmon that they chose not to eat. They hold the salmon without killing it, allow it to swim away, follow it, catch it again, release it again. Whether this constitutes play in any subjective sense that involves something like enjoyment, science cannot say with certainty. But the behavior is culturally transmitted. It varies by population, and it appears to be practiced for its own sake. There is the behavior around the death of matriarchs that goes beyond simple grief responses. In several well-documented cases in the Pacific Northwest, when an elderly matriarch died, her family group spent extended periods in the area where she died or where her body was last seen. They moved slowly. Their vocal activity changed. The behavior was not identical to normal travel or foraging behavior. It was different in ways that resisted simple functional explanation. And the other members of her pod, Matrilines that had known her for decades, also appeared to alter their behavior in the period following her death. Whether these behavioral changes represent something like grief, something like mourning, or something else entirely, the debate continues. But they are culturally specific. They occur in some populations and not others. They follow specific patterns within the populations where they occur. They are, in the broadest sense, social rules about how death is to be marked. The orca of different oceans have completely different rules. That sentence, simple as it sounds, contains within it a scientific revolution that is still unfolding. because the existence of culturally transmitted, population-specific behavioral rules in a non-human animal forces us to reconsider assumptions about culture, about cognition, about social organization that have underpinned our understanding of the natural world for generations. Culture was supposed to be the thing that separated us. The capacity to accumulate knowledge across generations, to build on the innovations of the past, to transmit not just genetic information, but behavioral information, not just what we are, but what we know. This was the human trait that explained our extraordinary ecological dominance, our spread across every environment on Earth, our construction of civilizations and technologies and social systems of staggering complexity. And now here are the orca, doing something recognizably similar in the dark, cold water of every ocean on the planet, invisible to us for most of their lives, and doing it in ways that are in some respects more sophisticated, more stable, more precisely calibrated to ecological conditions than anything our own cultural evolution produced in its first 100,000 years. The researchers who study orca are careful about the language they use. They are careful not to overclaim. The word culture in the scientific literature carries specific technical meaning, and the debates about whether orca behavior meets every criterion of that definition are ongoing and sometimes heated. But even the most conservative scientist who has spent serious time with this data will acknowledge that whatever is happening in orca societies, it is not simple. It is not reducible to genetics or ecology or individual learning. It involves social transmission. It involves accumulated knowledge. It involves something that functions very much like tradition, and traditions, once established, are deeply conservative. They resist change, they are enforced by social pressure, they define group identity, they shape every aspect of an individual's life, from birth to death. The orca are not following their instincts when they eat only fish or only mammals, when they produce their specific dialect calls, when they perform their greeting ceremonies, when they carry their dead at the surface of the sea. They are following their traditions. And their traditions are different in every ocean, different in every population, different sometimes in every matriline. A patchwork of cultural diversity spread across the global ocean that we have only begun, in the last 50 years, to see clearly enough to understand. And what we see, when we look at it directly and honestly, is something that challenges the comfortable distinction between the human world and the natural world in ways that are still difficult to fully reckon with. We have always known that other animals were remarkable, that they had capacities and experiences we were only beginning to understand. But the orca take this further. They show us that the capacity for culture, for tradition, for socially transmitted knowledge, for rules about how to live that are passed from generation to generation does not begin and end with us.